Welcome everybody to tonight's budget subcommittee meeting. Just to give everybody a heads up that we are televised and live under that assumption. Everybody should have in front of them an agenda with a packet of information that includes a draft skeleton presentation, meeting minutes for Monday, February 4th, and the latest 2020 preliminary budget summary. Everybody good to go? Excellent. All right, so the first topic for tonight's discussion is fiscal year 2020 preliminary budget and upcoming presentation dates. Connor, you want to lead us in this?
Sure. So in front of everyone is a freshly printed budget forecast for fiscal 20. This was updated today. Wendy, I believe the only change is to the insurance line. Is that correct? Okay, so all the revenue assumptions have remained the same. We're still being relatively conservative on that front, as we always are at this point in the year. We'll keep an eye on the state budget as it moves through that process. But on the expense side, the largest change is that we now have per plan rates from the GIC. And some good news is that the aggregate rate increase, as I might have suggested before, was around 3.3-ish%, but when you actually plug in the enrollment for town, school, and retiree, we're looking at, rather than the conservative placeholder of a 5% budget increase for all employee health insurance, we're looking at 1.28%.
Wow.
Which is good. That reduces the overall growth in the employee benefits and other insurance line items. Last we met, that increase was 816,000, just under 6%. Now it's 514 at 3.64. That's one of our largest, if not our largest, fixed cost drivers. So that's positive movement in the right direction. So the preliminary deficit, although we haven't done a formal change memo, which I anticipate we'll do in the next week or two before the budget hearings on the 25th and 27th, has dropped from 1.9 million and change to 1,598,178. So still a lot of room to go. I won't mention the weather.
Please don't.
But that's obviously welcome news. So we figured we would share that. Again, a formal budget change memo will probably fall in the coming weeks once we get some more information on some departmental budgets. So.
And Connor, that's 1.3% effective for total employee health insurance. That's pretty impressive, at least from what I experience on the private side, where percentage increases are generally higher than that.
Yeah, the GIC has performed very well for the town. So when you look at the last year we were in our former health group through fiscal 19, we were looking at approximately 1-ish% increases when you spread that out. From 18 to 19, we actualized, I think 1.01 was the percentage increase. And so now, again, we're looking at a very low premium increase, which is tremendously beneficial for our budgeting, obviously, but it's also good for the staff, because then their share of that also increases relatively marginally. So I do think that that's an important point, particularly when we're talking about structural revenue deficits and how tight our budgets are all the time. Folks are correct to say, well, you know, municipal governments have pretty generous health insurance plans. We do offer good insurance, but this is the insurance pool that we're in has been pretty aggressive in controlling year-over-year cost increases. So I agree.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important that benefits are one facet of the overall value of package that we give to employees, and I think that there's a lot of items that go into it, and I'm sure the employee insurance is good, and we need it in today to be competitive in certain cases in today's day and age. Question though, you had mentioned that the former health group, what was that rate of increase? I guess my point is that is there value in quantifying what would have happened if we had stayed?
Where we would have been?
Where
I
we
think we did a couple of years ago. We could run some estimates there, but it would be cumulative millions of dollars. The first year that we switched, we had a cut of $335,000 in spending. So, you know, it's usually a win if we could control cost growth.
Right.
It is rare that we can continue to get something comparable for actual fewer dollars, especially as you move into the future. So in that first year, we saved $335,000. But I believe in the years before we left, and one of the reasons why we were leaving, we were frequently seeing increases over 5%, were we not? I mean, we would see 7.
We may want to quantify that as we put together the presentation to talk about the opportunities and challenges that we see in the future. There may be some merit to quantifying the steps we've taken along the way as a group, as a town, and as a school system to mitigate some of those costs. I think this is a great example of us using the expense lines strategically to create operating expense opportunity elsewhere in the P&L. So
Sure, we can do that. In another area where that comes to mind, although not necessarily looking that way right now, we have property and liability insurance. That's one of our fixed costs. We have an estimated increase of about 11% in there, but that's an area that we've been able to save hundreds of thousands of dollars in the past few years. I think since 2010 was when we formed an executive loss control committee that has officials from the town and schools on it. They work on best practices for risk management, and we frequently have received close to $50,000 per year in premium credits through holding trainings, participating in trainings, and things of that nature that has been recognized by our insurer. So although the increase this year is substantial on a percentage basis, we've saved more than $450,000 in premium spending in that area as well.
that's huge, thanks. Good context. Anybody questions, thoughts on the prelim budget?
What drives the liability and the school increase there?
Wendy or
Property
Dr.
liability
Yeah,
insurance?
Dr. Brawl, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we just had a reassessment of the value of property this year, a routine
We did.
reassessment of values.
And this is about where we typically are at this point in the process as far as this $1.6 million. That's, I know it's always kind of, we're a little higher. And
It's not unusual. Obviously, I would like it to be less. Last year, the preliminary deficit was just shy of 1 million flat. So this year we came in at 1.9. That's obviously creates some more challenges. But we have, on many occasions, had projected deficits at this point well over 1 million and close to 2.
Okay.
Connor, the county and state assessments in the other expenditures, the plus $360,000 variance versus prior year, is that the state assessment related to largely charter schools?
That's correct.
And I believe that 360,000, just for everybody's edification, I believe that offsets the increase from state aid, so that net it's costing us more.
That's correct.
Offsets.
The
Right.
projected increase in state revenue to Easton in the governor's 2020 budget is 167,000 and change. But the increase in assessments is 360, so we're at almost a net cut of 200,000,
Got it.
which is extraordinarily challenging. State aid is our second largest revenue source, so flat or low growth in there is already a challenge, but when it's actually a net cut,
Right.
that is incredibly challenging.
I think just a mental note, we can get to it when we review the draft, but I had meant to include that in the state aid bullet point that we had under revenues.
Okay.
So I'll make sure to add it and/or wherever the appropriate section is. If that's better served in the school section, we can certainly look to add it there as well. I just thought it was impactful to your point that the second largest driver of revenues is effectively receiving a cut this year. And it did get me thinking, Dr. Cabral, to the fact that last year, if I remember correctly, mid-year, there were some grants that also went away, and it just got me thinking about that kind of types of revenue that may not be as reliable as they were in the past, and/or downright, in this case, going backwards, net.
I'll talk about a couple of them this evening, but only the ones that are salient only to schools.
Sure.
So I didn't talk about Chapter 70, for example, because it includes the town.
Right, great point. Anybody else in terms of the prelim budget? Questions? I know that we have presentation dates on there too, Connor. Did you want to go through presentation dates?
I didn't have anything really specific there except as it pertains to the third item, which is, oh, yes, I did actually. Sorry, I'm already forgetting that we scheduled these. March 25th and March 27th, that is a Monday, Wednesday, set up as we've done in previous years. We will have the joint meeting of the budget subcommittee, 3-month-old at home, of the finance committee and selectmen to review all departmental budget requests. I believe we'll be joined by the school committee on the first night as well for the school budget presentation by the superintendent. So the first night on the 25th, we're tentatively planning on having this budget subcommittee presentation that we're talking about tonight, be sort of an informal kickoff. And because that night also has regular business of the selectmen and the Easton Public Schools budget, that will probably be the majority of the budgets we're looking at, and then the rest of the departmental requests mostly will take place on Wednesday, just so we don't have one night. I think we had a 5-hour meeting recently.
Right.
I'm trying to respect people's time and spread it out. So those 2 nights, the 25th, 27th at 6:30, both at Frothingham Hall, as we've done in past years. So.
Don't sell those meeting participants short. I mean, they could handle 5 hours if they need to. I just want you to know. They might not want to, but
I'll remind those participants of that.
when the time comes, I think they might have
Next
it in
time
them.
it's 11.
Right? Well, that sounds like a good plan. Obviously, we'll defer to both of those, the Board of Select people and to the school department and to the Finance Committee, as long as the timing works out. But it feels like that could be a really great introduction and kickoff, I think, to help people understand our thoughts about the future and where we see some of the challenges and opportunities, and maybe give them a frame of reference with which to view the coming budget discussions through. Maybe help them understand that.
Sure.
Perfect. All right, discussion re-annual town meeting 2019.
Nothing majorly substantive to touch on here. Draft warrant articles were due last week. We were working on pulling together a draft of the warrant for town meeting now. That will be reviewed by the Board of Selectmen Monday, the 11th of March, and every regularly scheduled selectmen's meeting moving forward till town meeting, as is our normal process. And then I believe town meeting is May 20th at 7 o'clock, Oliver Ames High School. So this committee will keep it as a standing item if anyone wishes to discuss anything on it, but nothing directly pertinent to the budget subcommittee tonight.
Excellent, thank you much. All right, discussion regarding the budget subcommittee long-term financial planning presentation project. I think we just alluded to it, with the goal of the work product to be a presentation, probably in duration somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes. The first night, March 25th, of the joint meetings traditionally to kick off the budget season. Dr. Cabral, I see that you have an Easton Public Schools budget subcommittee presentation ready, so it would be awesome. I think you've probably brought some draft slides for us to review. Also in your packets are included a set of draft slides, I'll call it from the town side. Connor, thank you so much, and Michael, thank you so much for working to develop this skeleton, which by no means is complete, but just wanted to serve as draft placeholders to get the thought going. Let us know or give us an indication of where we might be headed in terms of slides, but certainly to engage this team and get their feedback about potential adds or subtracts, and to discuss some of the topics so that when we do give this presentation, we can feel confident that it represents all of our thoughts, all of the potential opportunities and challenges we may see from a long-term planning perspective, whether it's revenues or expenses. And I think it would be important and impactful given the composition of this board, where it has, of this subcommittee, I should say, where it has finance committee, school committee, select people, school department, all equal participants, I think, in a collaborative way, really trying to communicate to the town what we see as the challenges and opportunities. So maybe a couple extra words in there, but that's kind of what I was hoping to achieve. Dr. Prowl, I didn't know if you wanted to kick it off.
Sure. As this is the first time we're doing a presentation of this nature, not entirely sure of the slides that will be most helpful for that. So we have many more data points that we can bring up. If this makes you think of something else, between Marilyn and myself, I'm sure we can think about where we can pull that data together. Or perhaps something is not as useful, but it gives us something to go by. This first slide is how we are setting up our budget targets in the Easton Public Schools. This includes what we've been working on for our budget this year, so there are some very specific things. I'm happy to go over them if you'd like. I wasn't planning to go over each one. I'm doing that at the school committee meeting on Thursday evening. However, to give you an idea of how it is organized, I did this last year as well. Reactive and essential at the bottom of the circular chart. Those are the needs that we feel as a school department are reacting to some shortfall. So it's already something in place that we need to react. So I'll choose one thing on there, the EL teacher, that's an English language teacher. So there are parameters and guidelines that you're supposed to provide a certain number of service hours of training for a student depending on what level they are in terms of their English competency when they either enter the country or English is not their first language. We do not meet that, and so it is a reactive need. And so we need an English language teacher for that. Proactive would be anything that we know is imminent. It's coming either in the next year, we know it's very soon. An example of that would be full free day kindergarten, which I'll discuss a little bit later. That is something that is becoming more and more, across the state, more and more districts are eliminating tuition and it's becoming free. And we believe that that is right around the corner, that that is going to be a mandate from the state. And so proactively, we would need at least 5 years, we're estimating, to incorporate that into our budget. And that would be a proactive move that we don't have plans to start yet. Strategic, that's the things that research and best practices tell us we should be moving to. We always think about 2031. That's where our current kindergartners are going to be graduating from high school. So we don't think about next year or even 2 years from now. We really think about how are we preparing this student pre-K through 12 to enter the workforce or college in 2031. So that's really the forward thinking. It's what other districts are doing, comp districts are doing, places around the country, around the globe are doing to prepare their students for really life in the 2030s. Regressive at the bottom, that's actually where we would be if we are unable to achieve any of the goals in our reactive, proactive, or strategic plan. Instead, we would be regressive. That would be taking our current level of service right now and scaling it back, whether that's staff layoffs, decreased services, increased class sizes and fees, or a combination of any of those things. Did you want me to go through any of this, or?
So do you believe that we're in the reactive essential category this year? I think that's where we landed last year.
Well, I will say that, again, out of respect for the fact that the school committee is going to get the full presentation on Thursday, I didn't attach the percentages to this. So on the side, there's going to be percentages and real numbers for the school committee on Thursday. Last year, we were firmly in reactive. We were actually able to secure the mostly personnel, mostly mental health personnel, if anybody happens to remember the presentation, in the reactive budget. Again, they're reactive, so it didn't really put us forward in any means, but we were able to react to some needs. This year, so far, I believe we're either going to be partially in reactive and partially in regressive, or regressive.
Understood. I think that will be impactful, and completely appreciate the deference to presenting to the school committee first. I think that would be an impactful slide for us to be able to demonstrate to our audience. So once those percentages are factored in, I think that would be very impactful. And the dollar amounts that would be necessary to go and step up would also be very impactful. I won't ask you for those dollar amounts again, out of deference to Thursday's presentation. The only thing I would say is I wonder how that they will compare against the $1.9 million that it would take for Easton to get back to the average rate of our core group as identified in the community comparison, the average rate of the core group. And I'm not saying that that statistic is accurate or not. It'll just be interesting to know that comparison. Perhaps they both will be bookend data points that say under one methodology we are at this point, and under our own methodology, in this example, it would be at that point in order to get to certain levels of providing educational aspects to the town. So I won't ask you, even though I am chomping at the bit to ask you those dollar amounts. But I think
We do need to refine it a little bit more. We're
Certainly.
very early,
Yep.
per typical in our budget process to be nailed down as much as we are actually. We're very close, but we just need a couple more figures.
Understood.
Tom, could I actually just ask to clarify, the budget subcommittee presentation is not intending, it's my understanding, to look at fiscal 20 projected programming, is it? Because we're kind of looking at actuals on all the town side at least.
So I think it could be where the data is available.
Right.
It could be a healthy blend. Anything that we can do, I believe, to help the town understand the future challenges we may face. If there are some 2020 items that are known, quantified, and vetted, and we feel comfortable articulating them, I think it's acceptable, and I defer to the team, certainly, to pull that forward. To me, this slide would either read last year's information, which says we were largely reactive and essential.
Sure.
This year, it might be helpful to simply state that we have, in this particular example, fallen from reactive and essential to a blend of reactive, essential, and regressive. And I think that's exactly the financial canary we're trying to signal in the coal mine that says we're not making progress to doing things that are proactive, strategic, with long-term beneficial consequences. We seem to be staying stagnant together, and or in this case, potentially slightly regressing. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. I think just one suggestion would be that if this is to be in the 2020 budget presentation that the schools would be giving that night, that if it's alluded to, that could be powerful, but I don't know if you're kind of putting the lead out there for your budget presentation if you did the same thing twice, if you understand what I'm saying.
I do, and maybe it's not this exact slide.
Sure.
To your point, maybe it's some bullet points that we raised to demonstrate where we believe the progress and or lack thereof on the continuum of getting ahead or not is being made. So in this case, it may just be a bullet point that says in FY19 largely we were reactive and essential. And as we look forward, we believe that we are not on a path to improve that. If anything, we believe we may be on a path where we're in a partially regressive state,
Sure.
With a lot less words. But, that's that might be nice enough. That's what we're trying to articulate with this piece that fits into the budget subcommittee presentation is simply that we are not on a path that's leading to proactive and strategic decision-making on behalf of the educational system of the town. And if anything, we believe that there are continued challenges that may put us into a more aggressive posture under the current path and circumstances. And I'll let the school department wordsmith that the right way.
So a couple questions, if I can, on this here. Where you were referring to the future state of being a mix or being regressive, are you basing that off of the current numbers that we have in here, the 42,983, or are you making that prediction based off of where you expect you'll be after resolving the 1.6 projected deficit?
Well, we always try to present the budget that's going to be the final.
But to be clear, the number we put on the town budget was just a placeholder.
Right.
Right.
We understand that we're not being offered 4%.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And so the reason that I'm asking the question is to what we were just discussing. Why would we hesitate to suggest to look at the future? I mean, when we're talking about slipping in 2019, I'm sorry, into 2020, into the regressive world, are we not beyond canaries and coal mines? Are we not in sound the alarm territory at that point where we would want to message that as loudly and aggressively as possible sooner rather than later?
So my suggestion was not that I think that this report cannot or should not be forward-looking. I'm looking at it more from just kind of a technical perspective of if this exact slide is to be presented 30 minutes later in that evening as part of a 2020 budget by the schools, to just avoid the redundancy, that's all, and to allow, and to preserve.
I misunderstood.
Well, and I'm glad you asked, because I'm trying to be clear. So something that we've talked about is, and I think this is important, and I don't think anyone on the subcommittee wants to see otherwise, It is obviously the responsibility of the superintendent and on behalf of the school committee to present the budget for 2020 for the school system. So all I'm suggesting is just for us to try to kind of walk into bubblegum and not have this kind of strategic assessment take all the wind out of the 2020 budget presentations as they pertain to the departmental requests in the schools. I probably could have been more clear.
So just to, again, it's the first time it's been presented this way. Will we present the town and school budgets, and then there'll be sort of a summary wrap-up of that from the budget subcommittee, or does the budget subcommittee do a launch and then we do the two?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
We were thinking, I believe what we were trying to frame is with possibly 10 slides at best, where we believe the town, and when I say town, both the town services and the school system, where we as a subcommittee believe we are headed structurally from a financial perspective. Do we have excess funds? Do we have a strategic excess funds that we have to allocate and invest wisely? We don't. So can we articulate and to those bodies that will be in front of, probably hard ones, that we continue to face a structural revenue deficit, and hey, heads up, don't let that be wallpaper. We have said that for years. We have tolerated that for years. We have done budgets for years. But if you let that become the norm, we believe that will be a challenge. And we want to just maybe jolt you awake to hear the same thing. And I know that's odd, and then I think on the expense side, it's an illustration that says we have done some amazing things with the amount of expenditures that we've had, and that the people, the town, the schools just really execute incredibly. But we run lean, and that in itself could be a challenge if we face a downturn and revenues become even further stressed for us. And then I think if we can give them that lens and that walk away that says, we really need you to wake up, we really need you to engage, not that you were sleeping, engage on the budgets that you're about to hear, because we believe as a town, this is a critical point in time where we're either going to begin solving that structural revenue challenge, or we're going to continue to face expenditure decisions that will lead to potentially regressive states. And I'm not speaking about the school system, but that's also, I think, language that would apply to the town side, where there will be negative consequences from, if we believe this as a team, underinvestment in key categories, whatever they may be. Does that sound good? And if we can do that in 30 minutes and 10 slides, hard ones, I think we've teed everybody up.
So I think in terms of procedure, to Connor's point, this is probably the cornerstone of our presentation. So yes, we would present this, but from a budget subcommittee perspective, to say the school department was in reactive last year, now the budget is about to be presented, we'll see where they are. Even strategic, proactive, reactive, essential, and regressive on here to set up what that looks like without all the detail.
Right.
Perhaps
Exactly.
I could provide that to you.
Yeah, I think that would be very helpful. It could just be a bullet point that said last year we were in reactive essential. We believe this year, as you'll see in the pending discussion on the budget.
But it's a good segue, because I think the idea here is like a 10,000-foot view of these are the historic and recurring challenges that we're all facing in all of our departments. This is what that looks like on kind of a global scale. And as you're going to hear from every single department, or maybe not everyone, some departments are doing just fine, but from many departments, there are real needs that we are not necessarily in a position to address, which does not mean that they don't exist.
Right.
And I think that people will speak to that during their budget presentations.
Well said.
That's the crucial point that I was getting at. I very much like how we were characterizing it, the discussion of a pattern.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for
Absolutely.
the clarification.
So before I move on, we put together some slides, a few examples of program challenges and a few examples of resource challenges. Part of this presentation is inherent in talking about the proactive and strategic goals of the district, is explaining what we don't have as a district. So we haven't made slides on those. That's sort of part of the process. When you're talking about, foreign languages for elementary school students, inherent in that plan is the fact that we don't have it right now. So we didn't break those out, but anything like that you want broken out, we can do. So a couple of the program challenges: average class sizes. What we did was, we never know who to use in a comparison. We find that lots of people use different ones. So we took, for the purposes of these slides, we used our most immediate neighbors that were like size, all of the audit towns that were identified in the operational audit, and our DART towns, which is in the Department of Education, who they compare us to. Came out to 17, including Easton, so we just used all of them. You can see where Easton is. We're at 19.1 for our average class size. We are third from the top. Average class size takes the toll. I mean, this is not broken down by grades, of course. It's going to be different across the grades, subjects, content, etc. However, you can see that even the state is far lower at just over 18. And it does make a big difference in terms of what we can provide to students and the level of attention, especially in this current climate where students are presenting with a lot of significant needs. Here's where I was bringing up the K tuition in Massachusetts. So I know you can't read this. I was just using this as I have another slide that explains this more clearly. But just to give you an idea of this slide, tuition rates for 2014-15 and 2018-19. I actually presented this first one to you in 2014 and said that many of my colleagues are moving away from charging. You can see that the legend, and if you just want to go by color, the legend at the bottom, the darkest orange, is the highest tuition. And in speaking with my colleagues around the state, what they're doing in their districts is slowly reducing by 10, 25, 35% their tuition over 5 or 7 years so that they are eventually tuition free. So even the ones you see still represented there, many of them already have a plan in place, which is a great step ahead of where we are right now without a plan in place. We believe strongly, especially when you are able to see this map. This can be Googled very easily if you take the title of this slide. We believe that ultimately the state is going to require that kindergarten is tuition free for all students, and we will be grossly underprepared for that. We estimate that to be about $700,000 or $800,000, and we cannot absorb that in 1 year.
So I'm reading that correctly, that something that we pointed out on the town side in the comparison report was, I think it actually might even be the same year gap. The last time we did a community comparison report, where were we and what's changed? And we highlighted that the disparity in per capita has grown. And so am I reading that correctly, that when this was first brought to us by you in the 2014-15 academic year, 262 communities had tuition-free full day?
Yes, out of 351.
And now, to exactly your point, 31 more of your peer districts have, or of school districts, now it's 293. So the pool of communities that do not have full funded is shrinking. So if from a state perspective, a mandate is only going to hit 50 or so communities, including us, right?
Exactly.
And are we the darkest orange?
We are.
Okay.
Just going to ask that.
We're currently the darkest orange. We do not have a plan to lower that. In fact, our kindergarten is currently running in the red right now.
Wow.
At the highest tuition.
That's impactful.
And if you look at some, this is where I get a little nervous, when you look at some of the districts that are still in orange, you see that it is some of the districts that may be better able to afford it based on their per pupil expenditure in their district, like Duxbury, for example, like Concord. And so I really believe that we're going to get to a tipping point where some of the needier districts are in full day kindergarten, and then the state's just going to say the rest of the districts can afford to make that adjustment. And if we make that as a 1 year adjustment, it's going to be extremely problematic.
Okay.
Out of the 17 districts we were looking at, all the ones at 100% have free full day kindergarten. The state is at 96%. Easton has the lowest number of kids that are of the kindergarten population in town attending kindergarten in our public schools at 88.5%. So all of those other children are getting prepared sooner and better than our children are in kindergarten. Then we have the MSBA building project. Again, we just turned in a 699-page report about the educational plan on this, so there's a lot of detail that could be shared, but some of the highlights that it does not just Center School, but all 3 elementary schools do not meet the educational plan of the district. They we have state findings and citations in all three of them for facilities, facilities needs. None of the schools have computer or science labs. They don't have music or art rooms. The nurses' offices are inadequate. Nurses' offices without a sink, for example, or a bathroom. Play facilities are outdated. All three schools have traffic and parking problems. There is no meeting space for confidentiality. You have to walk through a teacher's room, for example, at center school to get to the principal's office to have a meeting with the principal. No community spaces for performances. You can't get the whole school there, not just in parking, but even to have everyone in one space. Building remediations and abatements. All the schools have had remediation, whether in lead or asbestos. We are definitely staying on top of it, but the older the buildings get, the more we have to be proactive about fixing when something is close to being worn. And we share staff. So just in terms of operations, having staff travel between the three schools, it's costly because we're paying them while they're going in between the schools as well.
It also inherently creates a workers' comp risk too, right?
Certainly.
Is this the single largest capital project that is before the school department for the foreseeable future?
No question. In fact, the base repair costs of all three schools to fix all three is $86,501,000 and $882,000. That does not fix any programmatic issues. It does not fix any citations due to space, anything like that. It just keeps the walls up, the roof on, the asbestos out.
So on that point, I think it's an important one that if you look at the draft slides that Tom had, and this I think goes for town and school facilities, something that I think is worth including. We've been talking more about it in our budget presentations, but the town has, in addition to our programmatic needs, there's the capital needs, right? And I think that's a really important point beyond the fact that, say, we did have 86 million to bring these three schools up to full repair. I think it's such an impactful point that if you did that, that doesn't bring it into the 21st century. You basically have brand new buildings from the 50s. Except it's 2019, right? So
We're still not meeting the educational needs of the students. We're still not meeting state requirements. It doesn't take offices out of closets. It doesn't do any of that.
But I think that for the average person who may not be involved in school building projects, you would think, oh, wow, that's a big number. But if you spent that in the hypothetical, I mean, so this is a hypothetical we use as a comparison point to the MSBA project, and I think it's really important. And I'm glad you mentioned it, that even if we did this, we're basically, okay, good, we're back to post-World War era, which is, not, let alone that this would come with no MSBA funding.
Correct.
Back to the previous slide, is it fair, so if something like this were included in the budget subcommittee report, we would also highlight this as a huge opportunity, though, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
That's one of the, so these are all needs of all three of these schools that could be addressed. All of them, right? So I think that's reiterates, obviously, that the school planning committee is working very hard communicating that, but I think that that's really important.
And I mean, there are estimates. There are estimates on the 4 remaining configurations of new buildings. None of them are $86 million. Right. And they all provide spaces that fix all the programmatic needs in the town as well as the actual facility. Okay. Some resource challenges. Again, we're choosing the ones that we think are the biggest ones right now. Tom, you alluded to the grant history in town. We have, you're going to see, perhaps I should have switched these, the needs of the students rising as the grant funding is decreasing. Couple of new grants have come in. That little tiny green sliver you see is a new grant, but it really is, I think it's about $8,000. We've lost other grants, 30, 40, 50,000 over the course of these 4 years. We lost over 100,000, almost 200,000 in Title I funding.
What is Title I?
Title I is it's traditionally low income. It's based mostly on low income.
Okay.
But it doesn't necessarily go to a low income school. It can go across the district. Yeah.
Dr. Cabral, you spoke about the fact that the grants declining while at the same time programmatic needs are going up. Are those programmatic needs based upon state law and federal law? Like, are those, is it a similar situation as to what we saw with the charter schools where we're getting assessed at a higher rate, but we're getting less income, so it nets to zero? Is this a similar thing where we're getting less grants, but we're being asked to do more?
There are a couple of things, yes. So here's one example. This is just the circuit breaker. This is reimbursement for out-of-district special education costs. So for example, the red line is the total cost to the district. It's almost $3.5 million at this point, but you can see the circuit breaker is pretty much flatlined. So I think that's one example of what you're saying, where the reimbursement is flatlined, but the cost is increasing.
Absolutely.
And I also put the percentages down the bottom so that you could see over the last 4 years, the reimbursement percentage has decreased, and the legislature right now is considering 65%. Wow. So that will be a lot lower and our costs a lot higher.
Is this an example where if we potentially invest in certain, whether it's personnel or programs that would keep these students within Easton?
Starting in 2016, we put programs into place. If we hadn't, I can't even imagine where this would be right now. Most of the students that are in the programs right now, and we have programs in every one of our schools, would be an out-of-district placement. This would have been off the chart.
That's a really good point. That
is a good point.
And not, I apologize. I remember that got a lot of positive attention, as it ought to have, for being a smart management move, but I had already forgotten that similar to how beyond the bean counters looking at the health insurance budget, most people aren't going to look at, oh, good thing the town was in the GIC. But I think that would be one of those good data points for on the expense side, showing what the town and the schools have tried to do in the past 5 or so years to really be creative with trying to curb costs, because that obviously bore out well for the school system.
If there was a way, appropriately so, in this case it seems like it's warranted, and in the case of the insurance it's warranted, where we could help educate the town that we not only have looked at our revenue side, but even with our expenditures we have looked at with an eye towards how does that impact future expenditure levels. And if we could quantify and demonstrate, in the case of insurance it's millions of dollars, and if it is in the case of this, I think that would be very impactful to be able to show that our expenditure there, which seemed like an increase, actually resulted in net savings in this particular case. So if that is indeed the case, I think quantifying that could be very impactful.
Okay. It's difficult with special education only because depending on where their placement would have been, could be 40,000 or 200,000 per child, depending on where. I mean, we could hypothetically
quantify a hypothetical avoided cost, right?
Yeah. I mean, we could.
It could
get an idea, but
if there's a way to get a range,
low exposure, high exposure,
a bookend. But I believe it will most likely be a valuable and material amount, and I think helping people in the town understand that not only do we run lean, but if we hadn't been strategic and done more with less and thought ahead like this, we would be even in a more precarious situation in terms of our budgets.
One of the things about, to a point, Mike, I think you made the last meeting or one of the other meetings, it communicates that we don't just see this $80-something million number and say, oh, that's expenses. This translates into real things, right? This translates into services, and we're not only trying to maintain services, but we're also trying to be creative within the tight kind of margins we have to make some decisions on the expense side that help save money, which I think is important.
While we're still in the phase of determining what's part of the presentation and what we're presenting, one of the thoughts that goes through my mind looking at these sorts of analyses, number one, the analysis that you just suggested is crucial. It illustrates the very hard dollar value of that sort of planning. By the same token, I think we're at a point where it is critical for us not just to say we have made these decisions pertaining to these issues down here on the fringes, on the edges, that have created real value, and look at how wonderful it is, but that we have in effect neglected what we ought to be doing overall, and are potentially missing much more. In other words, I would hesitate to have us simply communicate that there are relatively speaking, small dollar issues around the edges, and miss out on communicating the very large dollar issues that are foregone in this.
Yep, good point.
Also, for special education in district, special education costs have increased. Teaching staff, you can see, is in blue. Other instructional is in red. That would include mental health professionals, for example, and the in-district support that we have to create these programs. The out-of-district portion of the special education budget, I do bring out-of-district up because it is the most mercurial part of our budget, even more so than utilities, which is pretty difficult to estimate. Truly, and you've heard this before, one child's out-of-district placement could cost $200,000. That's common, actually. So it could change these numbers quite a bit. You can see that the percentage of the special education budget that has gone to out-of-district has increased a great deal over the last 6 years. This is the total in dollars.
And that is in spite of bringing certain
Correct.
services in-house, right? Because you can bring services in-house, but obviously you don't control,
Right.
attendance, right?
Well, there are some students that we just aren't prepared to serve properly.
And now, is this a challenge I would imagine that districts are grappling with around the state? And is the primary method of supporting this, at least from the state's perspective, the circuit breaker reimbursement?
Yes.
And that's what has been kind of being,
Been decreasing,
as a percentage, which
looking
is,
at potentially a 10% decrease
Okay.
this year.
If I could mention also, though, we can't just say our costs are up, we'll just ask the taxpayers for more money and they'll just give it to us. Whereas the programs in which these children are served can just say, we're raising our tuition rates 10% this year.
and then
there's
it's an
absolutely nothing we
assessment
can do.
to you.
I mean,
Yeah,
well,
we-
it's effectively an assessment, it's just the price goes up and we don't have any control over that. So yes, the state will pay a portion of that, but our cost also goes up and there's absolutely nothing. It's sort of like the regional school situation where we don't really have any control or leverage, so.
And we do get those letters. I've gotten 3 probably in the last 3 months, where you get a letter and it says, thank you for being part of our program. Please note our tuition is changing as of this date. In fact, I got one on February 6th saying it was changing on February 1st. Clearly, the budget's already done. It is not calculated into our budget. Now it needs to come from somewhere else. So that is extremely problematic for us.
A couple questions. One is, this looks to be about 6.5% of your total budget on a $43 million budget. How does that rank to our neighboring communities and our comparable communities? In other words, I think that there's some tipping point where we may not serve every single need that arises within district. It would be so probably cost prohibitive to prepare for all of that. So that if our 6.5% is in line with what other communities are doing, that might be knowledgeable, helpful. If the 6.5 and/or 2.75 million, which I estimated, is much more expensive, that might help us understand that there may be an investment opportunity in our community, whereby if we keep more in-house, I believe it also works the other way, where if we have the ability to provide, we can get students coming into district as well.
We have 3 students right now that are, because obviously we want a well-run program that has been going for several years before, and needs space before we can bring students into it. We have 1 program at the high school right now that has 3 students, 4? 3 students in it from other districts. And so it is a revenue source. Right now, we can't do that at the elementary level because we don't have the facilities for that. It is in line with many of our lake districts. This is something that I've been talking about a great deal with my colleagues across the state. It's a huge problem in the state of Massachusetts. There are not enough beds for students with residential needs. There aren't enough placements for students. We're all fighting for the same spots for our kiddos. So there are cases where a student because they need to be accepted into a program. So we petition to have a student accepted into a program. We send all of their records. If they do not accept the student, we go further and further and further away from Easton. There are incidences where a student has to travel so far that we actually have to turn it into a residential placement because that student can't travel 3 hours each way every day. So it's a huge problem in the state of Massachusetts, not only with the critical needs of students in the special education spectrum, but our mental health students. We have students going to other states and finding placement in other states because we cannot find anything around Easton for them. So it's a much bigger issue in the healthcare system right now.
Is the early elementary school project something that we could plan for to add in space and opportunities for this type of programs and bring people in, or is that precluded because then you have no way to graduate them through to the middle school, or RO to the middle school?
In terms of funding, we cannot set up anything that would be a source of revenue for the school, so we can't add extra space in the hopes of being a revenue source in the future. We do have these programs set up with much more appropriate spaces for these children in the developing plans of the new potential new building.
Got it. And when's the last time we looked at our rates? I know there's only 3 people in the high school, but do we look at our rates each year to see if they're
Every year.
competitive? Great.
Went up this year.
Awesome.
Our total per pupil expenditure, I know that we bring this up all the time, but I think it's important, since we were talking about these 17 districts, to show where we are. Our per pupil expenditure is in the $13,000 range. And then you can see we're the 4th from the bottom. One figure that we've used in the past is to take the average in the state, and get the difference from the state average, which is $15,911 per student, times our current enrollment. That would be $8.3 million more to our budget. However, we realized that the state is at the far right of this chart, so we took Walpole, right in the center, very, very similar in many ways to our district. We use them as a like comparison for many things, demographics, scores, achievement, and so forth. If we were to use Walpole, they spend $15,000, well, the per pupil expenditure is the combination of Chapter 70 funds, the town's investment, and all of the grants that the district receives. It would be $5.4 million. Just to put it into somewhat of a perspective without the numbers on my very first slide, that entire page, including everything under strategic, would be paid for if we had this $5.4 million.
Say that again.
So far, what we've priced out, this entire sheet, for reactive needs, proactive is the combination of reactive and proactive.
Yeah, and understand.
And then strategic is the combination of all three. The $5 million that if we had similar per pupil revenue as Walpole, it would include everything on this page. It would be strategic, it would include everything. We would be well into our strategic planning in Easton.
What I thought you said.
That is mostly what the individual towns or communities contribute. This Chapter 70 money has become less and less of a factor.
Right. Well, and that's the case for most, at least most of Easton's like communities, right? I mean,
Right.
if you look at Chapter 70 in the current governor's budget in Easton is projected to increase by 0.71%.
My reason for drawing attention to that is that is a much better way of saying what I babbled through in the comment that I made before about how we present the value of what we have. I was referring before to things that are around the edges, things that may or may not be relatable to people. I mean, when you're trying to model out what was the opportunity cost avoidance, that is something that's not necessarily relatable to the average person. Tom, you were talking before about the importance of doing that. Most people are not dealing on a day-to-day basis in their own lives with the attendant hassles and costs of sending their child out of town to receive an education. But being able to talk about the things that we believe our town's leadership and professionals say that we need to do to be serving our children, we can achieve that with a particular price. Just went to exactly the point I was attempting to make before. That's a powerful point. That's why I asked you to repeat it. So, sorry I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's
I think
okay.
that's
I'm sorry I
crucial.
don't have those figures tonight, but I'll be presenting. They will have figures on them on Thursday.
So does that, by definition on the math, I was just trying to look up the Walpole school budget for last year. Does that by definition mean we're $5.4 million under their budget? Or that is just a per pupil spend? I understand the per pupil spend, I just wanted to understand how that might correlate to the actual budget dollars that each one has, just in case there are dollars that go other places. But it is about
actual
that,
budget.
that difference.
Including grants.
Right.
Yeah.
Chapter 70 and town reimbursement.
Well,
Or
but
town,
Tom, is your question, is Walpole's education budget 5 million and change larger than Easton's? Or is the question,
Right.
it is, which happens to also line, well, because that slide was, I thought that slide was demonstrating if Easton's per pupil expenditures were that of Walpole, Easton's budget would need to increase by 5.
Correct.
That's what I heard.
That's correct.
Right, but that's a different data point than Walpole's budget could be 5 million less
They have a
if they have
different
smaller
enrollment,
enrollment.
Right.
But I
That's,
think there's, what's the difference in pupils? They're pretty close to I think they have pretty much the same enrollment.
I don't have their enrollment on here. I can get that really easily, but.
And that's exactly the point
This
I
is
was
per
trying to
pupil.
delineate,
Right,
or
because
just
those are-
explore.
well, that's important to delineate as well, because you want to be clear in that communication, right? Because somebody could
Right.
say, well, wait a minute, I looked, their budget's 3 million less.
Right.
And you would just want to make sure you're,
Like, I understand this math entirely. I was just wondering if, to your
You
point
have to
exactly.
factor the number of students.
Right, if it's a
The
similar
difference is- it's very similar.
enrollment, that's even
Yes.
more powerful, because there could be some discussion about economies of scale, there could be some, you get this, I don't get that type thing, but the more similar they are, the more powerful that statement becomes. Now, I believe that you had some other cities that were in there and towns, but Walpole is certainly one of our benchmarked communities that we looked at for the community expenditure comparison. And so it might be interesting to see the average of the others and where that gets us to the 1.9 million that we were able to see from just a base level per capita community expenditure level. And these might be the beginnings of the framing of the bookends of here is what we believe is the opportunity from the school side as a budget subcommittee, which could extend, in this case, we know of potentially as low as 1.9 million, which is a huge number even still, to as high as 5.4 million, which is just a huge number with, you factor in the potential for $800,000 of risk that may be out there in terms of a statewide mandate for kindergarten, or an $800,000 foregone opportunity in terms of providing a valuable service to the town of providing that as well. That's interesting.
We can achieve what we think we need to achieve based on what our leaders are telling us. We can achieve what we need to achieve if we can just figure out how to spend just what Walpole is spending. And that'll get us achieving what we need to achieve for far less money than what everybody else to the right of that chart was doing. We'll get to where we need to be, where we think we can be, what we think we can do for our community, for far less money than what those guys at the right side of the chart were doing. That's how good of a job our school committee does, but that's what we need to do to get there.
And Walpole's doesn't meet the state average. I mean, Walpole's below the state average, and then we're much further below the state average, but Walpole
Is I'm assuming because you used it, that per pupil is the appropriate metric that gets discussed
It's always the-
regarding
yeah.
schools.
It's really the only way to do apples and apples comparisons.
Understood.
They have about 350 students more than we do.
Not massive.
We use them for
10%.
comparisons and everything.
Yep.
I know we use that all the time, but I even wrote my notebook as per pupil expenditure actually instructive. That's what I was just jotting down there. But it is what everybody uses, and it is instructive, and the issue is, what do you do with your per pupil expenditure? We've got a really low one. Does that tell the whole story? No, but what we can say is based on the first slide, we are behind where we need to be. And we don't even need to get to the state average, we're pretty sure. We're so good at what we do, we can get there with substantially below the state average.
We don't even need to have what Walpole has.
Does Walpole have free paid-for kindergarten
They're one of the districts that is moving to it.
to it? So they're
Plan to move to it.
so it's not as if $800,000 of that 5.4 million is that's just, if anything, a part of it. Interesting. What would you? The answer may very well be proactive and strategic, but what would be the key differences between Walpole and Easton that creates that monetary gap? Is there any things that might pop up that school did? Like, for example, if it was they provided kindergarten, it would be, well, they have $800,000 of sunk cost and we don't, and that's $800,000 of the 5.4 million. It might be they've invested in SPED programming or programs to keep children with needs inside the district. Is there anything that stands out from that perspective?
We've been talking an awful lot, trying to get exactly at that answer.
Sure.
There's not one thing exactly, but we're still working on it.
Yeah. Yep. It would be easy if there was one thing. Usually it's a little bit everywhere. Interesting. Those were awesome slides. I think the discussion was very helpful. Anybody have any thoughts or pieces?
To wrap my head around, one of the kind of rumors that you see out and about is around enrollment numbers, and this idea that, well, if we can get enrollment numbers down, we could cut school costs, but that's actually very ill-informed idea. I'm just kind of curious to understand like your perspective of enrollment numbers and if they're healthy or how you're grappling with those when we're thinking about per pupil spend and the impact of any given number. I understand you want it to be somewhat level over time, but
Sure.
yeah.
Well, the more students, the better.
Just kind of counter to what a lot of people think when they think, oh, we have to get it down,
Right.
but there's a lot of fixed costs with operating a school.
Right, exactly. I'm not sure why they.
That's just one of those things
Like
you see out and about. I think it's a talking point that you kind of see on social pages and whatnot, and it's definitely ill-informed. And I think people have this perception of, oh, wait, this is driven by bringing new people into town and growing the town in certain ways that cost more money. But it's actually the opposite of that. Having it level or growing keeps the cost per people down and shares the cost across.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's how we get our reimbursement from the state is per pupil.
Right. Well, and so, I mean, if you're just looking at it from a kind of economic standpoint, if there is a fixed cost to operating any school district or town, which there are, fewer is not as efficient. You don't achieve economies of scale. But as far as enrollment, and where we look at this in the school planning committee, enrollment is not actually dramatically increasing in the past decade, correct?
Right.
So, I mean, I know a lot of people will point to and say, well, Easton, on this side, of the House tried to meet its goals and comply with Chapter 40B. We added diversified housing units to the town, but that doesn't necessarily trump broader demographic trends, right? I mean,
Correct.
folks are having fewer children.
Correct.
So our enrollment, I won't ask you to quote it, but I believe it's relatively flat or down, is it not?
It is down. With the MSBA's projection of the next 20 years is that it will increase, but not by a marked amount. In
Right.
fact, when we give our numbers for the classrooms for the future, they're not allowing us to add extra classrooms for extra bodies. That's pretty much
Right.
what we
I
have.
just think that'd be a helpful point, like, you know.
Well,
for
right,
people
so
who are-
in fact,
Yeah,
right,
just
not
say
even
that.
talking about projections, the
Right.
fact is we have fewer students today than 10 years ago, is that, or within a hair? So that's
When
important.
I came, there was over 4,000 students.
Okay, so there you go, and I think that slide said
So, like,
33 and
that's 20 years
change.
ago, yeah.
Right.
Now we're down to
So that's really important that, these are tough conversations and tough issues, and we're talking about, multi-million-dollar funding gaps and things like that. And it's always, I think it's always interesting now, we talk about the phrase structural revenue deficit being kind of, I think you called it wallpaper. It's the most boring wallpaper ever. If wallpaper was ever not boring. But that is now kind of sort of like a fact of life we talk about as a premise of our conversations, but not so long ago that was not necessarily the case, right? There was question or, okay, well, do we have a revenue problem? Is it spending? And so we've now, thankfully, we've done a tremendous amount of research. We've had outside audits. We've had internal benchmarking. We've had a tremendous amount of engagement from people on finance committee, school committee, in the community. And so now it's kind of just mentioned in passing, like, oh, you have a revenue deficit. But it was, in my time here, that was not necessarily something that was accepted. And so it's important that if we're going to try and solve problems, that we operate from an agreed upon set of facts. And if we're talking about challenges the school is facing, if folks are under the impression that the schools have, had this explosion in enrollment, that's going to skew and hinder the productivity of that conversation, right? If that is in fact.
Thank you for saying this so much more articulately than I could convey.
Well, but it's so that's important.
Well, another interesting statistic, though, is when I came, there were under 100 kids on free and reduced lunch. It hovered right around the 90s. We have over 600 kids on free and reduced lunch now.
Well, I think that probably fits, and I'm not an educator, so I would always defer to the schools, but that fits into, obviously, I think you had a slide, Dr. Cabral, last year or 2 years ago when talking about the reactive needs of the school department of just how many kind of different services are necessary and provided. I think the phrase you were talking about, neurotypical children, compared to what, a common assumption of, okay, you have some teachers and maybe a librarian or a nurse, but there's so many kind of critical needs that are being provided that have grown, not just in Easton, but these are kind of nationwide challenges that schools are working on. So it's important to have those kind of set of facts, and we'll probably include a couple of those bullets in this presentation. I think is beneficial having that there. Certain realities that, we're not here tonight to debate whether enrollment has gone up. It has not. That is a fact. So let's
That's
talk.
regional. In fact, it's national. And
Absolutely.
it's,
It is.
attributed to primarily the recession. And there is an expectation that that will either, kind of even out. But Easton's enrollment has gone down less than most of our neighboring communities. I mean, we've actually kept steadier than most communities.
A lot of communities
So,
have closed schools.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, and those are broad trends, right? I mean, you have people are waiting longer to have children, having fewer children. There's a billion different economic reasons, including most people in my age cohort graduating school with tremendous amounts of debt. They're delaying purchasing homes and all those things. So it is important to kind of reiterate that fact that enrollment, schools' costs are going up as the cost of doing most business increases year over year, but it's not because there's hundreds of new children. It's actually the complete opposite is the reality.
That is true.
Question at a higher level, two things. One, are we losing students in any way, shape, or form because parents are sending their kids to private schools at a higher rate because they believe the current Easton school system may not be up to par with what they're trying to get at any different rate than surrounding communities may be doing so?
I don't see a marked increase in private schools. What we are seeing an increase in is the vocational school.
And is that similar in nature to what surrounding communities might be experiencing?
It varies. It varies by community, honestly. Some communities are seeing that, yes.
And how would we phrase what this all means now? In other words, from a budget subcommittee where we're tasked with identifying the challenges and opportunities and providing the strategies with which we would solve aforementioned opportunities and challenges, what does this one mean? Does, for example, I'll lead off the discussion, does it mean that there is a tangible connection whereby educational system results, scores, and students within the educational system itself leads to higher property values in communities? And then therefore, this is why it is important not just to provide services to those that enjoy the school system, but it also enhances value for the entire community overall. And I don't know if that's a true statement, that's just an example of what this might mean, but
Well,
how would,
It does increase the value. I field phone calls constantly from real estate agents who call to ask about the school department. Ask me to compare ourselves to other towns. If someone is planning on downsizing at any point, they're gonna plan, I think, to sell their home to a family. Gonna sell their family home to a family. So you're gonna want to attract a family to the school system. So there's no question that it adds value. However, I just wanted to say one thing before we went off the topic of the career education. We have a lot that we can offer in our schools, but they're in strategic, okay? Career tech, ed, internships, Chapter 74 programs, integrated technology, STEAM connections. We know there are things we can provide to our students. The vocational schools are starting to pick up some of the programming that traditional high schools had done in the past if they're unable to do that. Okay, for example, you wouldn't expect an Oliver Ames to have an automotive department. That would be cost prohibitive to start a department like that. But we could have a computer science department. We should have a computer science department. But we have one computer science teacher that just came on board a few years ago, couple of years ago. We just added computer science as a course, never mind as a career path. And computer science is one of the things that we have under Proactive because the state is considering making computer science a graduation requirement. Once that becomes a requirement, our students need to take computer science, and we don't have enough teachers to teach computer science right now. And that's just at the high school. Computer science concepts, computational thinking, that should start in kindergarten. And it should be interwoven throughout K through 12. But we're not there yet. So it gives the opportunity for vocational schools to start bringing in programs that really could be taught in a traditional high school.
absolutely.
You said you have one computer science teacher. I'm assuming the answer is you probably know, but is there a general rule of thumb? So say with a high school enrollment you have, how many computer science teachers would you need to actually make sure, to have an adequate number so that every high school student could actually take a computer science class?
I can't tell you offhand. More than one.
More than one. Safe to say.
Are there, just keeping.
We have,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm
No,
just thinking of
please.
a quick comparison. We have we only have one health teacher in the entire high school, and we just added them this year. First time. Our students in high school do not get health, and we're talking about all the social emotional needs and the vaping and the drugs and societal challenges, mental health issues. And we have one health teacher that we just added. He sees all freshmen for 45 days. So that's not even a full year. So one
a
person.
quarter, right?
Right.
Of a school year.
One person sees one class for 45 days.
And that's it for
Gives
4
you an
years?
idea.
No.
And that's
Just
it for 4
freshmen.
years.
Well, yeah, so
Right,
if
they have
I...
45 days of health, and that's it. So we need to proactively add health teachers as well. We have one health teacher at the middle school right now and one health teacher at the high school, and those are the only health educators in our district.
I imagine this, as you're talking about this, to me, as a parent of a teenager and a preteen, I think to myself, my children are being educated for the future. My children are grappling with the same social challenges everyone else's are. And the thought that they would not be getting strong foreign language instruction, the thought that they would not be being exposed to the basics of programming, of that type of thinking throughout the entirety of their educational career is astonishing to me. And I'm thinking about the words that we're using up here: reactive, essential, proactive. You look at that number 2 category and you think to yourself, proactive, this is something good, aggressive we're doing. We're getting ahead with proactive. All you mean by proactive is we're not going to be suddenly hit with a $10 million assessment someday because we failed to keep up with what everyone else is doing.
They're about to become reactive.
Exactly, but even more substantial, strategic sounds like it's something that's really futuristic, where we're breaking the mold. Strategic just means we're delivering what children today should expect, what their parents should expect that they're getting. There's nothing up there. Kindergarten, paraprofessional, nurses. We're listing that as the really futuristic stuff we're doing. To me, I'm looking at this, and I'm starting getting animated, but I have children, and I look to the future, and I very much care about the future of work and lots of nerdy things. I look at this chart up here, and I think to myself, if this were a hospital system, reactive and essential categories are, we're not currently laying off nurses, that we are sterilizing the equipment, that the lights work in the operating room. Proactive is, we're thinking it'd be a good idea if we had vaccines. We're thinking it'd be a good idea if we kept all of the doctors going to get their CME. And strategic is, we have a few people doing some drug trials and stuff like that. In other words, we're listing as strategic. We're thinking so. I'm sorry, backwards is the wrong word because that's insulting. That's not what I mean. But we're thinking so intrinsically reactively that we're putting strategic up there when what we're actually talking about is strategic is reactive. It's reacting to the real world, the world that we're asking our children to live in 40 to 60 years from today. Our strategic should be reactive. I'm on my high horse, but I think
it's a
this
balance,
is
right?
crucial
But
for our time.
let's not confuse, and I understand why you did it, and I appreciate it certainly, but let's not confuse for the audience and for the town the difference between strategic should be reactive if this is a school department slide where they say what reactive is, and I would just preserve the right for them to frame it
It's
their
fair.
way, but applaud the passion. I think that's important. That's what we're trying to bring to the table, which is some of that passion, which is emotional and subjective, is important to, I believe, intersperse to what we're trying to communicate, that there may be aspirational goals that we all would like to strive towards, and they all may be weighted differently depending upon who you are and what your value system and what you believe is important to the town. But so I am glad that you were passionate. I would just not intersperse the difference between making strategic reactive if this is how the school wants to position.
And I
If
respect
that's
that.
fair.
I'm just saying our aspiration is nurses.
Well, I have to, I love your passion. It sounds a little bit like some of the actual rants I've gone through over the years. It's frustrating. We have always been funded at a very low level compared to comparable districts. In fact, I've been on the school committee a long time. 25 years ago, we were in the bottom 4% in funding for the state per pupil. Now we're up to about bottom 9%. So we've made a lot of progress in that 20 years. It's very frustrating, and I absolutely get how you're conceptualizing those things, and I actually agree with you. I respect Tom's point that, he's trying to, respect Alicia's way of framing this. It's just that we've gotten so used to being sort of modest in our aspirations that we settle for this. But I do absolutely understand what you're saying, and I appreciate so much your articulating that because, obviously my kids are long gone from school, but it has been a source of such frustration for me that our kids can't have what most other kids in the Commonwealth have in terms of programs in the schools. So I'm going to just piggyback on that passion and say thank you very much, Michael.
And, you know, the balance as we try to, which I think this is so important to get these discussion points, whether there are concrete examples of economic benefit. I think of our presentation to try to address all of the stakeholders, those people who may believe that they don't see merit in enhancing and investing in the school department. They're entitled to that opinion, and if we can help them to understand that there is value creation via real estate values, I think that's important to point out. I think some sense of aspirational is important to kind of where do you want to be? Do you want to be a town that people, not that they, I believe they do, they respect our educational system. Do you want to continue to be that town where people fully respect your educational system because we're investing in it, growing it, and supporting it in the ways that the experts are asking us to? I think those are all helpful. And I balance that with the fact that, and I can't find it, Connor, I was struggling to see it, I'm not searching any pages, but I believe here it is, the average single-family tax bill is $6,740. And I'm not saying this to tamp down in any way, shape, or form enthusiasm, but I think in our presentation we may want to acknowledge that at $6,740 compared to blue is core communities, we are the third highest of the 9 core communities. And it's I think I say that not because we should or shouldn't look for more tax revenue. That's not why I say it. It's just a recognition that people have real feelings about what they pay for their tax bill in terms of the economic pain. And it might also help inform us in terms of how we develop our strategies to solve for where it feels like as a team we would like to be, which is not in the reactive and essential or regressive, whether we're talking about the schools or the town. But in order to find more revenue, acknowledging that our folks pay the third highest tax bill out of the 9 core, it might just mean we either have to ask for more in some ways, encourage economic growth on the revenue side, as we think about the strategies to solve the challenges I feel we are going to lay out, if that makes sense.
Certainly.
Any other thoughts on first of all, this was awesome. Thank you so much. I think this generated a tremendous amount of engagement and helped reconfirm, I think make real, and give some key points that I definitely believe we could incorporate into a couple slides without stealing the thunder of what's to come. But really, I think portray the challenges that we face. Anybody with thoughts or points that they would really want called out? So I have a couple. I think there could be a simple slide that speaks to average class size. I think that we could add a resource slide, discussion about grants and challenges. The average class size might be combined with per pupil expenditure, and a couple examples to comparison communities that get us to the 5.4 and the higher number, whichever ones are more appropriate and valid to have. So that in a simple slide, we could probably articulate some of the challenges that we have. And then perhaps the opportunity slide is, the MSBA. There might be a risk slide that about the free kindergarten, and we're already moving there. We see the train coming. We're not engaging on that solve like other communities are. I think that's a crystal clear example of the things we should be giving a heads up on. In an ideal world, it feels like we should be putting $200,000 away this year, and then next year $200,000, and then in 4 years we've covered the $800,000. It sounds like that's what other communities are doing. That seems like a reasonable financial approach, and it doesn't sound like that's realistic to happen this year. And the more things like that, to me, that is a crystal clear example of us kicking the can down the road, and that at some point that's going to come due. Feels like it. Either we're going to be forced to do it, or we're going to forego doing what we may believe is the right thing to do. And aspirational may be too strong a word, but I'm not sure Easton, and this is subjective now, so not soapbox-ish, I hope, but I'm not sure Easton wants to be the last community to implement free kindergarten and set that tone and that statement that says, here's where our value system lies. And I defer to the school department to make that statement. if that is, but just feels like we want to challenge ourselves potentially in this case to be better, and that might be what we want to incorporate into this presentation a bit.
And I do think to tie it back to what I think started the bigger picture conversation was, Mike, your point about whether or not there is value in kind of touching on a highlight reel of what we have done to work and reduce our expense growth and save expenditures where we can. Well, so I agree in one sense. A lot of those in the scheme of 80-something million are marginal, but it does add up. And I think when we're talking about when we're in a place that's so tight where we're saying, well, wouldn't it be great if we could be more strategic and maybe whittle 200,000 off a year of the cost of tuition for full-day kindergarten? When you save 300 and something thousand in healthcare in a year, that makes a huge difference. So that's why I agree. It's important to not basically say, okay, mission accomplished, we can go home, we save some healthcare money. And that's not my intent. But I do think, particularly to Tom's point on the sensitivity on the tax bill, Easton, we try so hard to have apple-to-apple comparisons, but every community is truly unique. Easton does have unique aspects of it, and you cannot fault someone who would look at this conversation and say, well, wait a minute, how is it that my tax bill is $6,000 plus, and other communities it's less, but that community is spending more on school? What's going on here? So I think it's important not to, as much as I'm glad that structural revenue deficit is kind of a fact of life, it's wallpaper now. I think it's great that we have, I think, very professionally and routinely analyze our management and our expenses. We try to save money where we can. I do think it is important, even if it's in passing, to note we hear you on, because somebody might say, well, wait a minute, if you need 200,000 more for the universal pre-K, why don't you just take it from somewhere else? I think it's important and illustrative to say we have, and we do it all the time. And necessarily as time moves forward, we run out of space, and the margins do become truly marginal, right? Once you can only shift health insurance into a new thing every so many years. You can only take full advantage of net metering credits, and then that opportunity is gone. You can, right, there's only, you can't just keep having those things come up. So I think it's important in recognition of a very valid viewpoint of, well, the tax bill is not low in Easton. And there are factors that lead to that. But like part of why Easton's such a beautiful community is there's a tremendous amount of preserved space. That space does not generate tax revenue. Easton does not see the growth necessarily that other communities that are very comparable to us in many other demographic senses, per capita income, population, road miles, things like that, that other communities may have had because they benefited from certain policy decisions many, many, many decades ago, like having sewer, right? And we're working aggressively on those things now. So that's my little soapbox on the importance of the kind of geeky marginal adjustments, because I agree there are broad programmatic needs for our bigger departments. There are, however, smaller departments that are doing well and may not have those needs, largely due to the kind of fixed, you need a certain amount of people to run a clerk's office, right? Most of our departments could certainly benefit with some additional support, but it is important that there are departments that may not necessarily need additional resources in a given year, and that those departments and the bigger ones too are working on those marginal adjustments, because that does play into that, I think. But both things are important.
Agreed. I had 3 takeaways that I thought of as you gave your presentation, not just about the schools, but I thought overall that we might want to provide the audience with a takeaway. One is, I believe that, Connor, you may have said it, but to continue to validate that this is an expense issue, not that this is not an expense issue, that it is a revenue issue, that we continue to vet and challenge the expense side of the equation. And every time we do, whether it's a community comparison, whether it's against a peer group that matches perfectly, whether it's against our own internal thoughts and aspirations, we continue to come up short. And that if it's not the expense side, then that leads us to the other side of the question. I think that's important to maybe as a takeaway statement. The other one was, I think, Connor, to your point, perhaps an explanation about the fundamental revenue constraints that Easton may face compared to surrounding communities, and I don't know if this is true, but it might be that we have a high proportion of untaxable and protected land relative to other communities, and therefore it's not as revenue generating. And that's a decision that this town and community has supported continuously via its CPA engagement, and much to its betterment, I might add. But
The
that
improvement of property values.
right.
And that's another thing that drives
so
that tax bill, is that property
it
is very valuable.
might be lack of commercial property as well, that, and that hence the importance of the sewer districts in helping us generate those revenues. I thought those were very important. And I thought one other thing, Mike, to your point, I'm going to use, I think, less words, but hopefully capture the essence of it. But today's strategic and proactive thinking may very well become tomorrow's reactive conversation. And maybe that's something, it feels like that is a theme I've heard both in talking about the town side and the school side, that there are some things, and I thought, Mike, your point about or at least I think you said it, the kindergarten is in the proactive, but pretty soon that may become today's reactive. And maybe that's important takeaway as well. I'm not saying those have to be it. Those are just the three things that I seem to come across.
So, Tom, how would you propose, we had floated, and I know everyone, it's budget season, it's town meeting time. I'm loath to tell everyone that more meetings are necessary. But you, I believe, may have floated a meeting between that, because if we do not have another meeting, then this is the last meeting before this presentation is presented.
Correct.
I think we have a good skeleton here. I think the school's brought a lot of good stuff to the table, but obviously we need to finish it. I'd be happy to hear from the superintendent, but I think there's enough here that we can just kind of close up a presentation with staff and email it back. And if folks have concerns, call a meeting. I'm also I don't want to take over it, so to speak. So
No,
if,
not at all.
If
So-
the subcommittee would prefer to meet again in a couple of weeks, that's another option. I don't know if.
Yep. I think we had 3/18 tentatively scheduled, and the thought was that, and this is open for discussion, the thought was that if we feel we can make progress to Connor's point, and we can put together a presentation of 10 to 15 pertinent slides, and we can gain alignment around them and feel comfortable with the information being presented and the takeaways, then we could be good to go. I'm happy to take the notes that we made and the comments that we made together as a team and maybe compile them onto some slides and do some legwork, if that's okay, and share them back with the school department to see if I captured the pertinent points.
Sure.
And get your input and/or slide adjustments, deletions, whatever you'd like. And if we can do that and get to a good place, maybe we can share it. And is it okay to share a document as
You
long as
can-
comments come directly to only me? Or,
If there's no deliberation, I believe it's acceptable, but you could share
Message.
something for informational purposes.
right,
If there's going to be major substantive feedback, I would say it's more appropriate to be here.
okay.
But if it's a question of, I mean, I know it's 7:30. We can kind of flip through this now and just make sure that the framework of this is to everyone's liking. And if that's the case, I think that's more than enough direction. Frankly, it would be more than we frequently need to operate with.
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to
Or-
go through these quickly, if that's okay. How about we go through these quickly? I'll take the commentary from the school side and work to incorporate it in.
And you and I can work on that.
Yep, does that sound good? And then spit it back for some thoughts, feedback, course correction as needed.
If there is feedback, then we should perhaps have a meeting, but if there isn't, then we're fine.
I think if it's very minimal feedback, like, hey,
Like there's an error
your
or
grammar is horrendous, Tom, I need you to course correct that, or could you please, add this point or that point? As long as I don't think there's a deliberative, or go back and forth and engaging in that way, I think we can probably get to the heart of it pretty quickly, and I could save you all the meeting time. So very quickly, it would be an intro slide, a very quick slide about the budget subcommittee role, like kind of a why we're here, what the objectives are for today. I just put in some wording of what are the challenges and opportunities that we have. Are we meeting them in a reactive, proactive, or strategic manner? What are the opportunity costs of consistent lean budgets? key considerations in meeting future needs and/or seizing future opportunities. You know, in this particular case, the goal is to, again, tee up the audience such that you're about to hear budget presentations. We are happy to be here. We're here to hopefully give you a lens with which to view them as we see the challenges and opportunities that lie before the town of Easton, given our charge. That's the takeaway. There is some wording at the bottom, and these are just thoughts or aspects that we may interweave to help people understand the point. But you know, I believe at our last meeting, we had a conversation of whether or not what we are doing is moving us towards a community that X number of years ago was a top 100 or further away. That's just a mental framework to help people understand how we see the issues. I think you can interject a lot of different viewpoints. Do you feel like you're getting ahead or not? Do you feel like you're making progress against challenges that we see in our community or not? To me, I think a top 100 happens to be an emotional appeal for what is a source of pride, I believe, to many in the community when that happened. And I would hazard a guess that most of us would agree after we listened to these presentations and have done our research that we're probably at best staying neutral and more likely than not moving away from being a top 100 community, giving our levels of investment in our departments across the community. I won't make that statement if we believe in that statement, but I believe it sounds like we're in a overall reactive posture. Is that a fair statement that we are in a flat to reactive posture? Would anybody disagree with that?
Well, I wouldn't disagree with that statement. I would frame it as we have an opportunity to move closer to a top 100 town.
Yep, understood. How does everybody feel? Some of this, right, we're charged with identifying what the challenges are to the community that we see in the future. Part of that, by definition, means we are putting a lens on what we think the future should look like. And that can be personal, that can be professional. I can use numbers to do that like I do every day. There's no wrong or right answer to that. So I don't want to cut out the subjective aspect of people's aspirations and what they believe the community should be striving to achieve. It doesn't always have to be about just being an average to the per pupil spend. To be honest, maybe it should be more than that, and we should aspire to be more than that. And I'm not saying we should or shouldn't, but if somebody doesn't reach for the stars, we'll certainly never.
I'll say it.
Right? So, yes, I think you would. Right. All right. So that's the.
And I think to the question of reactive, I think it's important to frame that in a kind of revenue standpoint, because I do think that a tremendous amount of strategic planning is routinely and very capably and professionally done by town and school officials and many of our volunteers. So I think it's important not to frame it in a way. So imagine this is the first time you've ever watched a meeting in town. It's important to frame it that it is not a lack of strategic capabilities, it is a lack of the ability to fund all of those strategic needs.
Good point. Very good point.
Because I do think that many of us rightfully take a lot of pride in the work. I mean, we have very extraordinarily detailed budgets that are strategic in their messaging, that have 5-year capital improvement plans. We do not have the funding to fix everything in that capital plan, but it's not as if we're kind of just lurching from year to year in the dark.
Good point.
I think that's very important.
That's a great point. The second slide just speaks to revenues from the town. So this gets to the discussion about our challenges on the revenue side. God bless you.
Is it fair to point out, this is, I think the end goal is to have a more kind of visually pleasing aesthetic, right? I'm not taking shots either. I drafted some of it. Yeah. Well, if
Mike
you look
didn't
at
print it in color. He did us no help.
The budget is tight. You don't print it in color here, right? Not kidding.
Exactly.
If you go to the next, just to skip ahead so we can go back.
Yep.
The next page is more of the format that this PowerPoint template is in. It'll be more visual in its presentation, with a lot of these points, I think, being more narratively communicated. But yes,
You got it.
I will not try to make it somebody puts people to sleep.
Good points.
Oh, sorry, Tom.
No, not at all. So a revenue slide, I thought we may want to add in about the importance of a couple things. One, to speak to like our largest projects that we may have had in recent years that contributed to new growth. So it may or may not, but Avalon came to mind.
Okay.
Just in terms of the economic value that it contributed both in new growth and mitigation payments.
Okay.
Maybe projections on what not the 45 Corners project, but the 5 Corners project.
Now that's ambition.
Right, be a lot of corners. But the projections in the Queeset project, but you know, hopefully this is the goal, is to present an accurate portrayal of where we see the revenue challenges. There's opportunities in there too, and I think the town's support of the items like the sewer district are critical, all those good things. If there are other revenue sources like grants that we should, that we could call out, or opportunities that we could call out, let us know. I'm not sure how it would play in, but if, 14,000 Easton voters wrote to their local delegates and asked for change in funding to get us more support for grants, that would be nice to see, but I'm not sure it would get us much. But I don't want to preclude.
There is a current foundation review board to look at how the foundation budget is formulated. We don't know how that's going to turn out.
Right.
And that's we're looking at the Chapter 70 funding formula, right? And is
There's actually 3 competing bills from the governor, from Tucker, President Tucker, and Sonny Diaz. There are 3 different
And
bills.
are any of them posed to benefit communities like Easton more than the current formula?
No, maybe
Not
Sonny
really.
Diaz, but definitely not the governor's,
No.
and not Tucker's.
No.
So I think that's something that might be worth noting, because we talked about the specter of maybe, A, the value question. Does Easton want to be the last town in the state to have full-day K? That's a value question. But B, eventually the state will mandate it. But that's perhaps an eventuality. It sounds like there are some other things that are significantly more prescient that are being debated now that could have an impact. I mean, Chapter 70 is the supermajority of our funding for state aid. So it might be worth noting that.
I think it is. I think that's a big risk that we should probably raise to the surface.
And we're seeing a lot of difference in like communities with the wage,
Wage adjustment.
the wage adjustment factor.
I'm not an expert in the.
Well, I didn't actually took the slide out of the presentation because I thought it was more on the town side, so I don't have it in front of me, but we are put into a quadrant, and Easton is in the, I think it's Bridgewater, Brockton, Easton, and Mansfield, for example, is
Boston, I think.
it's Boston. It's
Yeah.
it's
It's a different labor market.
whereas
Yeah,
we get
percentage,
100% foundation, they get 105%, for example,
Okay,
which is a big difference.
sure.
There's a sort of notion that our wages of other communities would be higher, for example, in Boston. But the truth is, you can't say to teachers coming in, we're going to offer you 25% less because we're in a wage adjustment area category that's for people that are working honestly at McDonald's, not for teachers in school systems. It's a flaw in the formula.
Can we talk, help me understand the wage adjustment? So the assumption is that a community like Easton would not pay a competitive
Right.
wage?
Right, but we can't.
Well,
Of all the things we can't afford to do, that would be to not pay a competitive wage to our teachers. I mean, if you,
Chapter 70 starts with the foundation budget. So the foundation budget is what it should cost to educate a child in
Right.
Easton. And then they calculate the Easton's ability to pay.
Right.
And then Chapter 70 fills in the gap.
Right.
However, as time goes on, once you're held harmless, it gets kind of complicated. But so that when you can't get any less, then if you're already above it, then you just get that $25 or $50 per pupil, which is the only thing that we've been getting. But there's some flaws in the foundation budget. One is the cost of health insurance. That is what all the districts are.
Right.
Special education.
And special education.
Which are two
Right.
massive drivers of
Because
cost,
right now,
right?
everybody is over the foundation budget. It's just how much over are you? I think we're like 37% over or something. So,
So the intent of a foundation budget is to give a number
so
that it
what
ought
they're
to cost.
what they're trying to do is increase the foundation
Right.
budget. But part of the foundation budget is based on this wage adjustment factor that to educate a child in Easton costs less because we're in this certain labor market versus somebody in Boston that's in a higher they would have to pay more.
But there are
higher.
flaws. Mansfield, for example, which is south and west of us in relation to Boston, is in the Boston labor market.
And average wages for the Boston, Cambridge, Newton
Yes. Boston,
is
Cambridge. Newton.
$80,000 compared to Brockton, Bridgewater, Easton, which is $49,014.
So that assumption has harmed us. That has harmed us since 1993, when the Education Reform Act was
We've talked to a lot of
implemented.
people about that, but
Yeah.
they obviously can't go to a town like Mansfield and take the money back now.
Right.
But they should
So-
try to fix it with this whole, as part of this fix. They should be addressed.
There's not a strong
It's
incentive
a
to
white
do
paper,
that.
Connor, if you want, I can send it to you.
Sure. Thank you. Sorry.
No, not at all.
Revenue
It's good that we all get educated.
So I think
This is
the
helpful.
question is there merit in including, in addition to our standard kind of big four revenue categories, anything, a bullet point that mentions that there are certain entitlement grants that, which is unique, right, for schools. Municipal operations don't usually have for us, a grant is something we do a capital project with, but school systems rely on entitlement grant funding, and that funding is shrinking. So that might be worth.
And we don't, I mean, the grant that we are entitled to are shrinking. There are a vast number of grants that we are not entitled to.
So it may be worth including that, a note.
And Connor, excuse my, I think this fits, but that would come under state aid, right?
No entitlement grants
A lot of
are,
it's federal.
It's both.
Yeah.
There's both state and
so
federal.
there are pieces of it then.
So if our total revenues are comprised of these items, where would the federal aid come in?
Are you looking at the town's budget sheet?
Right, like, so if we have, right now, FY 2020, we have 85,333,000. Where would the federal aid come in? So state aid, chapter 70, I get.
It's,
Well, the category is grants.
I know,
Right?
right, so it's not part of the budget.
Right, because the category is grants.
But it's
Federal
part of the per pupil spending, but it's not part of the budget.
Got it, so it's completely outside of this.
Right, it's not a grant
Understood.
subject to appropriation.
Understood, thank you. That's exactly what I was trying to get at. That's interesting. So to your point, should grants be a separate bullet point just to educate? Right, because in essence, it's a source of revenue, even though it doesn't fall into the revenue category, but.
Is this something you would like to include, or?
Again, I can take a look at.
Okay, we'll look.
Yeah.
For this presentation overall, I would recommend an executive summary slide at the beginning, in front of the purpose slide. And because, as I understand it, please correct me if I'm wrong, the rest of the presentations that follow on will contain the crucial detail, right? My inclination style-wise would be to keep the individual slides in our presentation as minimalist as possible. I would go out of our way to avoid the GORP and emphasize key points. In other words, the crucial issue that you raised, Tom, which we all agree with, the wallpaper commentary. I think that needs to be sort of profoundly front and center. There are countless analyses that support it. We all agree on that. For a budget subcommittee sort of opening presentation, I would frankly minimize those analyses. Not unless there's one or two that we say this makes the point crystal clear. I would not go with a preponderance of evidence kind of argument. I would go with the simple statement that this has become wallpaper. We know this now for a fact. This is beyond ongoing debate. This is an issue. On to the next one. The schools are dealing with this. The school says we need to achieve this. To achieve this requires that. And here's where we're at. There are countless, again, details that we can get into that Dr. Cabral will take us through and make the point strong. But I think as the budget subcommittee, my inclination would be say, get to the point, make the points, and then allow the subsequent folks to go forward. This then gives us something the community can go back to and say, the people who worked on the budget came to these crystal clear conclusions. If we want to argue the conclusions, we'll go to everybody else's detailed presentations.
Understood. I think that's the intent.
Well, it's a good point, and I think that actually we could probably shorten the rest of this conversation. And one of the things I don't know if we've addressed, which I think we ought to, is with that narrative style. And I think we kind of floated this, referencing that I ought not be someone selected for brief presentations. I think that it makes a lot of sense because this is a subcommittee that is representative of the 3 elected, or there are more than 3 elected boards, but of the Finance Committee, Board of Selectmen, and the School Committee, that the presentation be that kind of statement of fact to the point by one member of each of those committees. And that that room is going to be loaded with every technical expert the town employs. So if there are questions, at that point we could kind of get in and do our thing on that front. And I think that would be productive.
Yeah, no, I was going to make that. I think that's a great point. And I know that you folks will be presenting the entirety of the budget after the fact, and that's, I think, impactful. And to your point, I think there could be a lot of value if it's okay with the committee. I was thinking, Jackie, Caroline, if you and Jackie wanted to speak, I know that Jackie's the co-chair, and maybe there's some merit to that.
Also the chair of the school committee, so she.
Right, a tremendous amount of value to that. I would be happy to do it on behalf of the Board of Select people. I am not the chair of that, but I would still be happy to do it. This is in my wheelhouse. Craig, happy to have a chat. And Jen, I didn't know if you wanted to or if you wanted to chat with Mike, but I'll let you folks discuss afterwards. If we all think that's a good approach and we're all comfortable with that, I would certainly, let's go back to our teams, right? Go back to the school committee and make sure all the points are covered so that you feel comfortable with what Jackie would say and speak to. I'm sure she would cover all of the school points in a powerful way. And then we can split the rest of it, the town side, on the slides that we want to talk about. Maybe you covered most of it and I did intro, outro, or vice versa. But does that sound like a loosely good framework? And we'll split up the slides as we get the presentation finalized? I like that. Sound good?
Sounds like a plan.
So why don't we do that?
Perfect.
Alicia and I will chop up some details in the slides. I'll get that back through Tom. It could be distributed to the subcommittee. We'll do that in advance of a posting deadline if we were to need to meet on the 18th. And that'll basically give everyone here the option that something really jumps out at you, you think we're fundamentally off the mark from all of our conversations, we can have a meeting if we need to. And otherwise, we'll plan to all be in the room on the 25th.
Awesome.
Still save the date, right?
The 25th is happening.
No, I meant the 18th. No,
Sorry.
the 18th.
If I could,
to
and
be
not to
overly
put you
executive,
on the spot,
Skipping the
but
25th,
No, I
we're
know
going
the
right to the
25th.
26th.
Yes, I would say,
The 18th.
sorry, yes.
erring on the side of we're going to try not to get together on the 18th. If I
Right.
could just go around the table and ask folks if you had one statement to make that you wanted to make sure was made on behalf of the budget subcommittee during that presentation, what would that be? I'm just going to start at the end, Dr. Cabral, not to put you on
Or
the
the
spot.
beginning.
Pardon?
Or the beginning.
Or the beginning. Good point, right?
Now turned into philosophy class.
So this isn't 100% for the schools, but I think something very important that you mentioned was the fact of the focus on revenue. I'm well aware of many of my colleagues' budgets, the town budget, and of course the school department budget, and we run very lean. And I think it's a very common misperception to default to there must be excess and we need to cut. And I think the audit, among many other things, have showed us that's not the case, and that a focus of revenue is extremely important, among other things, but certainly.
Understood. Perfect, thank you.
I guess that, as you mentioned, that we have addressed the expense side and have been, as frugal as possible and cut where we could and
Excellent.
addressed some of the audit things.
Well, I know that a couple of people here have already mentioned this, but I think there's a large question. What kind of community do we want to be? What do we want, not just for our children, but for our elders, for everyone else in the community? And I think that that's something people need to think long and hard about as they listen to the budget presentation. And to Marilyn's point, we really have pretty much picked the low-hanging fruit. So.
Yes. So I won't reiterate what my colleagues have said, but I guess what my 2 cents would focus on are, what I said earlier, that whether or not we have revenue to program for all of the strategic things that we know we need is not the same thing as whether or not we are being strategic. We are being strategic. We know what these needs are. We are very serious about looking towards best practices. Our department heads and staff are widely respected. We try to pull those best practices in. And the thing that I personally care very much about is the town's reserve position. Because recessions are cyclical, there will be another one. We are working hard to build our stabilization fund. We have succeeded in that regard, but not enough, and we need to keep working on it. And that's going to continue to be a real focus and a real challenge, because building that stabilization fund necessarily pulls away from free cash in the budget.
I think it's important to continue to have a conversation about the percentage of state aid and how it's been reduced over the years. And that, granted that our per capita income in Easton is at such a level that the legislature looks at us and says, you can afford to take care of what you need to take care of, and we're not going to add additional money for you guys. And I think you look at the governor's budget and what he's added into state aid, and I think the whole issue of the foundation budget, where we got 3 competing bills right now going on, and I think that I'm not sure whether any of them actually benefit Easton in the long run.
I think I spoke enough tonight. I agree with all those points that were made. And Jen?
Sure, I wrote a couple down. So I think the phrase last year that came up again and again and still comes up is that doing more with less, and I think we'll hear the departmental heads stating that frequently, so we can kind of lay the foundation with that. I think there's a lot of value in pulling more benchmarking data and just showing kind of where we fit. I really love that community comparison white paper. And I keep on going back to that and thinking about how we fit in and kind of what lessons we can pull from those pieces that we got deeper. So there may be some nuggets we can pull from there that would help maybe drive some of the discussion further down the road, or just kind of draw people's attention to it. From earlier, the concept of just laying out facts, dispelling any myths, rumors, etc., and just laying out pure, hard facts and very clean, concise statements wherever we can. And tying to the vision and value, Kevin pointed out when we have to make decisions where we are revenue constrained, we're faced with trade-offs. So bringing the concept of trade-offs and what we're going to have to decide as a community, what's important or not, tying back to that value and vision for the future.
So if we don't solve for the revenue challenge, then we'll begin to get into a trade-off discussion.
Yeah.
Right. Sir?
And if you already spoke enough for tonight, I spoke too much. But
Never.
unlike you, I won't let that dissuade me from having an opinion anyway.
There's my guy.
I think that what we ought to do with this presentation, fully acknowledging that I'm the new guy in the room, is I think we should recommend, price, and lead. I think we should recommend what it is that we ought to do. In other words, our town leaders, the people who are in charge of departments, get paid to lead and get paid to know what the correct thing to do is. So let's state that clearly for the benefit of the community. This is what we think we should do. We should price that. We should explain to people that to do what our leadership says we need to do as a community, it costs this amount. And then we ought to lead with by making the sober recommendations about what we need to do to accomplish those ends. That includes what we're able to do.
Do you have examples of that you would say, or are you just saying that we should basically set up that framework of thought?
I think it should be the framework, but specific to tonight's discussion, Dr. Cabral's presentation, we have segmented our requirements in a sort of negotiate with ourselves way, and had I think a very healthy discussion about the words that we've chosen to use, but those are all things that our professional leaders have said, we recommend these are things we should do.
Mm-hmm.
And we have gone through and we have priced it. We have said that were we to achieve a certain amount with the Walpole numbers, we know what that costs. And then there's the opportunity for us to lead by positioning that in light of our budget realities.
Okay, so as long as we articulate that there are costs to, whether it's the town side or the school side, to getting into a position where we believe the town could address its future needs, that there is, and we frame it with the thought process of recommend and asking the audience to keep that in mind as they listen to these budget presentations, that it would be helpful and impactful. And then,
Exactly.
in essence, that we are asking them to lead, i.e. take action, as soon as you can to address what we are identifying as a future
Right.
opportunity or challenge.
Exactly,
Okay, got
because we're putting forward a budget for 2020. We're not going to solve that, all of
Understood.
these issues before. We know that, and we would be foolish to get up and pretend otherwise.
Got it.
But we should contextualize everything we're doing in light of our leaders are telling us this, and this is what it costs.
Understood.
So what are we doing?
Wendy, any key points?
I think we should also highlight just the kind of, thank you. I think we should also just highlight the kind of tax base that we have and how that plays into why we're in this position. Because being 90% residential makes a difference. Why is our tax bill the third highest,
Of that pair group.
but our spending is low?
Right. Great point. Michael, down the end?
I don't think anything really new to add, other than I think, it's important to keep stating the facts. As you said, some of this stuff has been said so many times, it is wallpaper, so making sure people understand it is real, that as been said, we've kind of already trimmed everything at the margins. There's nothing left to trim. So we're at this decision point now of what does the community value and what decisions are we going to make, to move forward into the future.
Excellent. Did anybody hear anything that they wouldn't feel comfortable with the team that ultimately presents saying? I didn't. I didn't hear anything that I disagreed with said by anybody as critical points that we wanted to make sure that we addressed. Perfect. All right. Good. So next steps are, I'll take a stab at just packaging some additional slides, trying to consolidate this down based upon the feedback, adding in some school information in color. Dr. Gual, would you mind sending the presentation to me? I can just hijack it. And I think that's about it. Anybody have anything else on this topic? We do have a request to approve meeting minutes, Monday, February 4th, 2019, 6 p.m. I'll give everybody just a couple minutes to scan through if they haven't already. If everybody's good and there are no issues, I'll take a motion to approve.
Minutes of February 4th.
I think we have a second by Mr. Petro. All those in favor? Excellent. Next budget subcommittee.
Excuse me, sorry, Michael, I will abstain, I was absent. Thank you.
Well, we've been told we can approve minutes even if we're not here, is that?
You can accept minutes.
Yeah, you can.
Yep.
But it's okay too.
I voted.
You can also abstain.
I think we have votes.
I think you're good.
Which is fine.
Well, I voted for it, that's why I mentioned that. I'm not here either.
Next budget subcommittee tentatively is March 18th.
That's six.
If we could hold that, it is 6 PM, same place here. We'll let people know relatively quickly. I think we can probably work over the next week or so to get a framework, whether we feel comfortable loosely.
People by the middle of next week.
That sound good?
No,
March 13th?
I don't want to overpromise. We have selectmen on the 11th, the diff thing on the 12th. That's
Sounds good.
a lot.
I have faith, though.
Gotta have faith.
But I agree. And thank you all for the flexibility while we try to do something that, quite frankly, I don't think has been done. So I really appreciate everybody's engagement. I know this might be more time than we may have thought it would have been coming into this cycle, but I think this is going to be a tremendous amount of value add to the community based upon our efforts. So thank you all very much for your engagement and teamwork. So there will be no public participation because there is no public. So with that, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Awesome. Thank you very much.